Hello everybody, welcome to week 6 of the course. We're officially over halfway, so we're getting there. A few administrative announcements. First, the midterm is coming up this week, so I will post the midterm on Friday morning at 7 a.m. You guys will have until Saturday at midnight to complete that. I've also posted a midterm study guide on our Canvas page. It's not question for question. It just says, if you understand these particular topics and can discuss them in some detail, then you should be good to go on the midterm. It's not open book. The format is very similar to the quizzes, with the exception of at the end, in addition to the multiple choice and true-false questions, there are also short essay questions. And when I say short essay, I mean 2 to 3 paragraphs, not necessarily 2 or 3 sentences. Yeah, but it's not open book, right? I want you guys to do this closed book. So let's see what else. Oh yeah, your grades. I will have to go in and grade the short essay questions by hand. So when the grade pops up and it's much lower than you would expect, don't worry about it, because that means that I need to go in and still grade and add the points. So it'll probably be a week or two, a week at least, after you complete your midterm before I get your final grades uploaded, because it'll take me some time to grade your short essay questions. So, okay, so last week we were looking at the introduction. And we've gotten through sort of the first half of Creswell's book, which is, also I want to say that I'm going to, I've had some students ask for sample proposals. I'm going to post some this week if I can. But if I don't get them up today, I'll get them up tomorrow. I'm going to try to find a qualitative proposal, a quantitative proposal, and a mixed methods proposal, and I'm going to upload those to our website. The only challenge with that is I'm only asking you guys to do sort of a short proposal for this class. I said 10 pages, but most of the proposals that you're going to find, research proposals for like dissertation or major project, are going to be usually a minimum of 25 to 30 pages. So I don't expect you guys to do that, but this will just give you a sort of a general idea, and you can condense down certain sections. I don't expect you to do obviously the same kind of proposal that you would do if you were doing a dissertation, for example. So anyway, so midterm study guide will be up, and some of these sample research proposals towards your final paper. Okay, so back to the introduction. So up until this point in the course, we went over sort of the preliminaries, right? We talked about choosing a qualitative worldview, looking at it from a quantitative perspective, the different kinds of inquiries you can do in each one of those. If it's qualitative, maybe you want to do an ethnography. If it's quantitative, maybe you want to do a survey, or you could do mixed methods, right? So we've thought about those things. We've thought about how to do a literature review around what our research topic and our research questions are going to be. We've looked at different theories, right, and how we use theories in doing research. Are we trying to sort of create a theory from the ground up, like maybe in a qualitative study, or are we trying to test a theory, like in a more quantitative study? And we also looked at things like ethics, right? These are just all sort of the preliminaries that you need to actually sit down and consider before you start writing your proposal. But now we've gotten through that, and we're actually into the part where we're going to start writing our proposal, right? And the place that you start with your proposal is you start with the introduction, and that's what Creswell is talking about in this chapter. And he says that there are 5 components, right? So the first thing he says is the research problem. You state the research problem. And he makes a distinction, and this is an important distinction because these come later. There's a distinction between the research problem and the research questions, right? So let's say, for instance, the research problem that I'm interested in is identifying suicide rates or identifying the causes of suicide among military veterans, right? Especially younger returning veterans. There's also a study done that came out last week talking about suicide among women veterans, right? So that could even be a more pressing topic: is why are suicide rates in women veterans so much higher than their civilian counterparts? So that's my, let's say that's my research problem. Now the research questions are where I'm going to be considering different things, like, for instance, does a veteran's woman who's entering the military, does their socioeconomic status, their sort of family background, a level of education, income level, things like that, how does that affect both their desire to join the military and sort of their predisposition towards suicide when they get out? So I can consider things like their socioeconomic status. I can consider education levels. I could look at psychological issues, employment afterwards, whether they were traumatized, maybe they were victims of military sexual trauma while they were in. So you starting off at the 10,000-foot level again with the research problem, which is where you're starting the introduction, and then you're drilling down into the questions. But the questions are going to come later. So the first component of doing the introduction is stating your research problem. This serves a couple of purposes. One, obviously, it's sort of framing your proposal for the rest of your study. It's telling people what you're going to be talking about, what you're looking at. And it also serves the purpose of serving as a type of hook, right? So somebody who's reading your proposal or reading your paper may actually be interested enough in what you're writing about to continue reading. So that's sort of the traditional introduction model, right? You want to hook your reader right off the bat. So you have your research problem, right? The next thing you want to do is you want to talk a little bit about the literature. Now, this is not a full-blown lit review, right, where you're talking about in detail about each book. This is just more like, what are the major studies that have addressed this particular problem, throughout recent literature, right? So you start to say, look, okay, here's the issue I'm interested in. I'm interested in suicide among female veterans. Jones and Davis talked about this, and in addition to Jones and Davis, Smith also talked about this, right? They are the ones that really have been digging into this issue. And then that leads into the third step, which is this idea of identifying deficiencies, right? And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but Creswell provides a really good model, and I want you guys to actually use this as your model for writing your introduction in the proposals you guys are going to be doing, this deficiencies model, right? So you have your problem, you're identifying the relevant literature, and then you're saying, okay, Jones did this, Smith did this, but neither Jones nor Smith really looked at this aspect of military sexual trauma and how military sexual trauma might actually be highly correlated with suicide amongst female veterans. So that's where you're saying, okay, this is something that they didn't get at, right? And that's when you get into this idea of sort of the significance of your study, right? And you're saying, look, this study that I'm doing is very significant, not only because of the sort of the epidemic of suicides among female veterans, but it's also important because nobody else has done this, right? Neither Jones nor Smith has looked at the relationship between military sexual trauma amongst female veterans and suicide. So, this has the potential to, if this happens to be the case, the military recognizes it. There are certain safeguards that can be put into place. The VA can take certain actions to try to really, cut down on this sort of epidemic of suicides among female vets, right? And then the last component that Creswell talks about is the purpose statement. That's essentially where you say, here's what I'm going to do in my research project. Here's my problem. here, this is usually where the research questions actually come in, right? Here's the problem, here's the lit, here's how I'm going to explore this particular problem. I'm going to look at, I'm going to be looking at the role of military sexual trauma as it relates to suicide among female veterans. Okay, let's see. Something else that Creswell talks about is how the introductions are slightly different among sort of qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods proposals. And essentially it goes back to the different natures among the qualitative and quantitative proposals, right? Remember, in the qualitative study, things tend to be much more exploratory, right? So it's not the same notion as it is, let's say I'm doing a quantitative study on military sexual trauma and female veterans, right? I come out and I have this theory that I want to, maybe it's a theory taken from another field that says, you know, victims of sexual assault are more likely to commit suicide. I want to take that theory and I want to try to apply it to military veterans, right? So I'm going to test that theory in this particular study, right? Qualitative study is not like that. Qualitative study is going to take a much more exploratory approach rather than a sort of theory testing approach. Oftentimes, you know, that can lead the qualitative proposals and qualitative introductions to be much more personal. Oftentimes, they will start with sort of a statement of why the researcher is interested in this particular topic. You know, where maybe they're a female veteran themselves. Maybe they're a survivor of sexual trauma. So yes, it's going to start with that sort of, perhaps start with that more personal perspective. It's going to be much more exploratory, right? And theory may not play as big a part in a qualitative proposal as it does in sort of a more quantitative proposal. Whereas with the traditional quantitative model, rather than, you know, thinking about the different concepts, I think that's what Creswell says as well. Qualitative tends to be more focused on concepts, exploring a concept or a phenomenon. Maybe the concept that I want to explore is military sexual trauma. I want to unpack what exactly is meant by the term military sexual trauma, right? In a quantitative study, you're sort of working with an operative definition of your concepts or your variables, right? So rather than being interested in the concept itself of military sexual trauma, quantitative proposal and quantitative studies are more interested in the relationship between certain concepts and certain variables, like military sexual trauma and suicide, right? So it's more focused on the relationship between those two particular things, or could be more things, whereas the qualitative proposal is going to be more focused on the thing in itself, right? The military sexual trauma. So, kind of a way to try to break this down. In the quantitative, you're not going to have. That's probably a statement of sort of the researcher's personal background and why they're interested in it, because you're still trying to maintain this notion of objectivity. You want to leave your personal values out of it, whereas in a qualitative study, personal values play a much more integral role in the project. So it really, you know, as we've been talking about, it really comes down to what are you interested in? You know, what do you want to actually understand all the intricacies of military sexual trauma, or do you want to understand, or are you comfortable taking sort of the pat or the standard definition of military sexual trauma and suicide, and you just want to see how those two things relate to one another, right? So yeah, and then he also talks about mixed methods. You know, and as he says that oftentimes in mixed methods there tends to be an unequal distribution between, you know, qualitative or quantitative, and typically the researcher themselves is going to have a slant more towards either a qualitative or quantitative perspective, and that's going to often influence, you know, whether the introduction is written more from a qualitative perspective or a quantitative perspective. It could also be a sequential thing where If the quantitative piece is coming first, perhaps the introduction is written from a more quantitative perspective than a qualitative perspective. But it really does depend. Yeah, and then the last thing is it's very similar to the 5 components that I mentioned up front. It's this deficiencies model, right? It's the same thing where the deficiency is the deficiency in the literature, right? So you have your research problem, you look at the literature review, and then you identify, okay, here's what's missing, right? Here's the gap. It's a type of gap analysis. Here's the gap in what's been done. And that's where I'm going to come in, and this is the significance of my study because I'm addressing this particular gap, and here's how I'm going to do it, right? And Creswell says to write a tight, concise introduction, which you guys are going to have to do. It says write 1 to 2 paragraphs on each one of those sections, right? Statement of the problem, literature review, deficiencies in literature as you see them, audience, significance of the study, and finally the purpose statement. We're going to talk more about the purpose statement next week. But that's essentially it for the introduction. It will change, slightly depending upon whether you're qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods, but you're really getting at the same stuff, right? It's just a question of what you're interested in doing. Qualitative, you're exploring a concept. Quantitative, you're exploring a relationship between concepts or variables. So, and that also affects, the role that your personal values play in the study. So, okay, I think that's pretty much it for this week. I'm going to be posting our discussion question on Wednesday. I did notice this past week that people were not quite as active in the discussions. And I understand that we're getting into the middle of the semester, it's the summer, things are picking up. This happens every time. But I'm going to ask you to sort of redouble your efforts, get back to where we started with the discussion, make sure you're participating, and make sure you're giving thorough responses, not just sort of cursory remarks. Really dig into the subject, and yeah, we should be in good shape. Midterm is on Friday. I'll send out a reminder about that. I'm also going to post the midterm study guide and some sample proposals. If you guys have any questions, post them on the course questions page. I'll also post the research question extra credit segment this week as well. So hope you guys have a great week, and good luck on the midterm.